The Pacific sun hung low over Tinian Island in the summer of 1945, casting long shadows across the coral runway that stretched toward the edge of the world. Beyond the tarmac, the Philippine Sea waited, dark, indifferent, and unforgiving. The air smelled of aviation fuel, salt, and the metallic tang of anticipation that clung to every pre-dawn mission briefing. Captain Robert Lewis stood beneath the nose of his B-29 Superfortress, watching the ground crew swarm over the massive bomber like ants tending to their queen. The aircraft, christened with a name painted in white letters along the fuselage, represented the cutting edge of American air power. 4 Wright R-3350 Cyclone engines, each capable of producing 2,200 horsepower. A wingspan of 141 feet. Maximum takeoff weight, 140,000 pounds when fully loaded with fuel, bombs, and crew. This morning, she was heavy. Very heavy. The mission parameters had been clear during the 0200 hours briefing. A strategic bombing run over Japanese industrial targets on the home islands. Maximum ordnance load. Full fuel tanks for the round trip of over 3,000 miles. 12 men would crew this flying fortress, their lives balanced against the promise of bringing the war one day closer to its end. Lewis walked the perimeter of his aircraft, conducting the pre-flight inspection with the ritualistic precision that kept men alive in this theater. The main landing gear, massive wheels designed to support the bomber's immense weight, sat compressed under the current load. The bomb bay doors were sealed tight, concealing 12 500-pound general-purpose bombs nested in their racks. 20,000 pounds of death waiting to be delivered. Flight Engineer Sergeant Jack Miller emerged from beneath the No. 3 engine nacelle, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. His face was unreadable in the pre-dawn darkness, but Lewis could see the tension in his shoulders. Miller was a veteran of 42 combat missions, a man who knew these engines as intimately as a surgeon knows the human body. "No. 3's running a little rough on the mag check, Captain," Miller reported, his voice flat and professional. "Nothing outside tolerance, but she's not singing like the others." Lewis nodded. Nothing outside tolerance. That phrase had become the unofficial motto of the 509th Composite Group. They pushed these machines to their absolute limits and sometimes beyond. The B-29 was a technological marvel, but it was also temperamental, prone to engine fires and mechanical failures that could turn a routine mission into a nightmare at 30,000 feet. "Can she make the run?" Lewis asked. Miller's jaw tightened. "She'll make it, sir. But I'll be watching her close." The rest of the crew assembled near the forward hatch as the first hints of dawn began to purple the eastern horizon. Co-pilot Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, his boyish face making him look younger than his 23 years. Navigator Captain Theodore Dutch Van Kirk, who could plot a course across the Pacific with the precision of a mathematician. Bombardier Major Thomas Farabee, whose job would be to put those 12 bombs exactly where they needed to go. Radio operator Sergeant Robert Schumard. Radar operator Sergeant Joe Steborick. Tail gunner Sergeant Robert Caron. Gunners, technicians, specialists, each man a critical component in the complex machine of modern aerial warfare. They climbed aboard through the forward hatch, squeezing through the narrow tunnel that ran beneath the cockpit, each man finding his station in the cramped interior of the bomber. The B-29 might have been a giant from the outside, but inside it was a maze of cables, pipes, instruments, and structural frames that left little room for comfort. Lewis settled into the left seat of the cockpit, the instrument panel sprawling before him like the dashboard of some impossible automobile. Hayes took the right seat. Between them, the throttle quadrant. 4 thick levers that controlled the engines, the bomber's 4 beating hearts. "Pre-flight checklist," Lewis ordered, his hands moving across the switches with practiced efficiency. The ritual began. Fuel pumps. Check. Hydraulic pressure. Check. Magnetos. Check. Oil pressure. Check. Every system tested, every gauge verified, every backup confirmed. In the B-29, redundancy was religion. At 0515 hours, the tower crackled over the radio. Dimples 82, you are cleared for takeoff. Wind is 090 at 7 knots. Altimeter 299er2. Good hunting. Lewis acknowledged, his thumb pressing the radio switch. Roger, tower. Dimples 82 rolling. He advanced the throttle smoothly, feeling the surge of power as all 4 engines spooled up to takeoff thrust. The noise was immense, a deep, thrumming roar that vibrated through the airframe and into the bones of every man aboard. The brakes held the bomber in place as the engines screamed their readiness. Lewis glanced at Hayes. The co-pilot's hands hovered over the backup throttles, ready to assist. Miller stood between them, leaning forward to watch the engine instruments with the intensity of a man reading a death sentence. "Engine temps look good," Miller called over the roar. "Oil pressure nominal. Number 3 still running a touch hot, but within limits." Lewis nodded. He released the brakes. The B-29 lurched forward, accelerating down the runway with the ponderous inevitability of something far too heavy to be flying. The airspeed indicator began to climb. 40 knots. 50. 60. The runway markers blurred past the windscreen. The nose wheel bounced over the imperfections in the coral surface, each jolt transmitted through the control yoke into Lewis's hands. 70 knots. 80. The bomber was committed now, too heavy and too fast to abort safely. 90 knots. The end of the runway was approaching, the cliff edge where the island dropped away into the Pacific. Lewis could see the ocean beyond, dark and waiting. 100 knots. Rotation speed. He pulled back gently on the yoke, and for a moment, nothing happened. The bomber continued to thunder down the runway, wheels still firmly planted on the coral, the laws of physics seemingly unwilling to release something so massive into the air. Then, with a reluctance that felt almost human, the nose wheel lifted. The main gear followed a heartbeat later, and the B-29 clawed its way into the sky, climbing at the barest minimum angle, struggling for every foot of altitude. They cleared the cliff edge with maybe 50 feet to spare. And that's when Miller's voice cut through the cockpit, sharp with alarm. "Number 3. Losing power on number 3. Lewis's eyes snapped to the engine gauges. The number 3 tachometer was dropping. 2,400 revolutions per minute, 2,200, 1,900. The engine dying even as they climbed away from the island at barely 200 feet above the ocean. The B-29 began to sink. Time compressed into a series of heartbeats, each one measured against the altimeter that was now unwinding with terrifying steadiness. 180 feet. 160. The Pacific Ocean filled the windscreen, its surface transformed from an abstract strategic element on a map into a very real and immediate threat. Feathering number 3. Hayes's voice was tight but controlled, his hands already moving through the emergency procedures they drilled 100 times in training but never wanted to execute for real. He pulled the feathering button for engine number 3, commanding the propeller blades to rotate edge-on to the wind, reducing drag from the dead engine. Lewis's left hand remained locked on the control yoke, his right dancing across the throttles, advancing the 3 remaining engines to their maximum continuous power setting. The cockpit filled with the escalating howl of right cyclones being pushed to their limits. The instrument panel vibrated with the strain. "What's our weight?" Lewis barked, his eyes fixed on the horizon as he fought to arrest the descent. The bomber was mushing through the air, not quite falling but not quite flying either, balanced on that knife edge between controlled flight and an uncontrolled plunge into the sea. Miller's voice came back immediately, the numbers already calculated in his head. 138,000 pounds, Captain. We're 23,000 over normal single-engine weight. The mathematics were brutal and simple. The B-29 was designed to maintain flight on 3 engines, but only if it was light, if it had already dropped its bombs and burned off most of its fuel. Right now, with full tanks and a complete bomb load, They were asking the aircraft to do something it was never meant to do. 140 feet. 120. Dump fuel. Hayes suggested, his hand hovering over the fuel jettison controls. Negative, Lewis snapped. We dump fuel. We abort the mission. We need every gallon to make the home islands and back. Not if we're in the ocean, Hayes countered, but he didn't activate the jettison. Both men understood the calculus of war. Dozens of B-29s were taking off from Tinian this morning, each one carrying the war to Japan's doorstep. Each one that turned back was a victory for the enemy, a small reprieve from the relentless pressure that was slowly strangling the Japanese war machine. But first they had to survive the next 60 seconds. Pull up the emergency procedures for 3-engine climb, Lewis ordered, his voice steadier than he felt. Dutch, I need a heading that gives us the longest possible stretch of open water. If we go down, I want options. From the navigator station behind and below the cockpit, Van Kirk's response came through the intercom. Come right to heading 270, Captain. That'll keep us parallel to the island chain. Nearest land is Saipan, 23 miles northwest. Lewis banked the bomber gently to the right, every control input measured and precise. With the number 3 engine dead, the aircraft wanted to yaw, to rotate around its vertical axis toward the dead engine. He countered with right rudder, his leg pressing hard against the pedal, feeling the strain already building in his calf muscle. This was going to be a long flight if they couldn't restart that engine. 100 feet. The ocean was so close now that Lewis could see individual whitecaps on the waves. The dawn light revealed the water's texture, the subtle gradations of color that marked currents and depths. It looked cold. It looked fatal. In the tail gunner's position, Sergeant Bob Caron watched the island of Tinian recede behind them, the runway lights still visible against the dark mass of land. He'd been in the tail when they'd lost the engine, had felt the shudder run through the airframe, had felt the sickening sensation of the bomber beginning to settle toward the water. From his position, he had the best view of their altitude above the ocean. Currently, he estimated it at somewhere between 75 and 100 feet. Tail to pilot, he called over the intercom, keeping his voice level. We're holding altitude. Maybe even gaining a little. He was right. Lewis could feel it now, the subtle change in the aircraft's behavior. The descent had stopped. They were no longer sinking. The 3 remaining engines, screaming at maximum power, were generating just enough thrust to keep the massive bomber airborne. The airspeed indicator showed 145 knots, dangerously close to stall speed for their current weight, but holding steady. 90 feet. 95. 100. She's climbing, Hayes breathed, and for the first time since the engine failure, there was hope in his voice. Miller was already working the problem, his engineer's brain running through the troubleshooting flowchart. Number 3 showed high cylinder head temp on the rune-up. I'm thinking we threw a jug. Cracked cylinder, lost compression, engine couldn't maintain power under load. Can we restart her? Lewis asked, though he already knew the answer. Not if it's a thrown cylinder. We'd need a full engine swap, and that's a ground crew job. We're flying this bird home on 3 motors, Captain. 110 feet. 120. The bomber continued its agonizing climb, gaining altitude in feet per minute that could be counted on one hand. But it was climbing. The ocean, which moments ago had seemed ready to embrace them, was slowly, gradually, falling away. Lewis made the decision. We continue the mission. Miller, I want you to monitor those 3 engines like your life depends on it, because it does. Any fluctuation, any warning sign, you sing out immediately. Hayes, work with Dutch on a revised flight plan. We're going to burn more fuel on 3 engines, so calculate our maximum range and give me options if we can't make it back to Tinian. The crew absorbed this information in silence. They all understood what Lewis was saying. They were going to fly a crippled bomber, overloaded and undermanned in terms of engine power, across 1,500 miles of Pacific Ocean, drop their bombs on Japan, and then try to make it back home. It was possibly insane. It was definitely dangerous. It was also exactly what they'd signed up to do. Radio, send a message to tower, Lewis continued. Inform them we've lost number 3 engine but are continuing the mission. Give them our current position, heading, and altitude. Tell them we'll update them when we reach cruising altitude. Sergeant Schumer's acknowledgement was crisp and professional. Within seconds, the radio room was filled with the staccato beeping of Morse code as he transmitted their situation back to Tinian. 150 feet. 200. The bomber clawed its way upward, each foot of altitude purchased with maximum effort from the 3 remaining engines. The fuel gauges showed consumption rates that made Miller wince. They were burning fuel at nearly twice the normal rate, the engines working so hard to keep the overweight aircraft aloft. At 500 feet, Lewis allowed himself a glance at Hayes. His co-pilot's face was pale but composed, his hands steady on the backup controls. They'd survived the first crisis. They were climbing. They were alive. But they still had to reach their bombing altitude, 25,000 feet, where the thin air would provide some protection from Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. On 3 engines, with their current weight, that climb would take over an hour. And every minute they spent at low altitude, struggling upward, they were vulnerable. "Gunners, stay alert," Lewis ordered. "We're going to be at low altitude for a while. If you see any enemy aircraft, call them out immediately. We're in no condition for a fight." The acknowledgments came back from each gun position. Despite the B-29's reputation as a flying fortress, bristling with .50 caliber machine guns, Lewis knew the truth. Right now, struggling at low altitude with a dead engine, they were about as maneuverable as a freight train. If Japanese fighters found them, it would be a massacre. 600 feet. 700. The sun was fully above the horizon now, painting the ocean in shades of gold and blue. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. Right now, Lewis barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to the instruments in front of him, the feel of the aircraft through the controls, and the sound of the 3 engines that stood between his crew and the ocean. Miller stood between the pilots, his eyes fixed on the engine gauges with an intensity that bordered on religious fervor. Oil pressure on number 1 was creeping higher than he liked. Number 2 was running hot. Number 4 was pulling slightly less manifold pressure than the other 2. 3 engines, each one critical, each one showing signs of strain. "How long can we run them at max continuous power?" Lewis asked. Miller's response was carefully measured. "Textbook says 4 hours. But these engines have already logged 180 combat hours. I'd be more comfortable if we could back them off once we hit 10,000 feet. We'll see what we can do. First priority is altitude. I want enough height that if we lose another engine, we've got room to maneuver." If we lose another engine. The unspoken possibility hung in the air like smoke. 3 engines could keep them flying, barely. 2 engines could not at this weight. If they lost another power plant, they would have seconds to decide between ditching in the ocean or bailing out. Neither option was particularly appealing at 140,000 pounds and loaded with high explosives. 1,000 feet. 1,200. The climb continued, painfully slow, but inexorable. Behind them, Tinian had vanished below the horizon. Ahead, the Pacific stretched to infinity. And somewhere beyond that endless blue expanse, Japan waited, their target, their mission, their purpose. Captain Robert Lewis settled into his seat, adjusting his grip on the yoke, and prepared for the longest flight of his life. 2 hours and 40 minutes into the mission, the B-29 leveled off at 18,000 feet. It was 7,000 feet short of their planned bombing altitude, but it was the best they could achieve on 3 engines with their current weight. Miller had recommended they accept the compromise or risk burning out the remaining engines before they even reached the target. Lewis made the call. 18,000 would have to be enough. The Japanese coastline appeared on the horizon at 0843 hours, a dark smudge that gradually resolved into the distinctive profile of Honshu Island. Van Kirk's navigation had been flawless, bringing them to within 2 miles of their planned landfall despite the engine failure and the revised flight parameters. 5 minutes to initial point, Van Kirk called over the intercom. The initial point, the geographical marker where they would begin their bomb run, flying straight and level toward the target regardless of what the Japanese threw at them. In the bombardier station in the nose, Major Farabee hunched over his Norden bomb sight, making minute adjustments to the complex mechanical computer that would calculate the precise moment to release their ordnance. The 12 500-pound bombs in the bay represented months of industrial production, thousands of man-hours, and millions of dollars in national treasure. His job was to ensure they didn't go to waste. "Bomb bay doors coming open," Lewis announced, flipping the switch. Hydraulics whined as the massive doors beneath the fuselage swung apart, exposing the bombs to the slipstream. Immediately, the B-29's airspeed dropped by 10 knots as the increased drag took effect. Miller's eyes never left his gauges. The 3 remaining engines were already operating at the ragged edge of their performance envelope. The additional drag was pulling manifold pressure down on all 3 power plants. "Losing airspeed," Hayes called out. 135 knots. 130. Lewis advanced the throttles fractionally, coaxing every last bit of power from the engines. The airspeed stabilized at 132 knots, just barely above stall speed for their current configuration. That's when the first burst of anti-aircraft fire erupted 200 feet below them, black flowers of smoke and shrapnel blooming in the morning air. Flak. Karen's voice from the tail was sharp. Multiple batteries, 11 o'clock low and 4 o'clock low. The Japanese gunners had their range. At 18,000 feet, the B-29 was well within reach of the 88 mm and 105 mm anti-aircraft guns that defended Japan's industrial heartland. More bursts bracketed the bomber, the explosions close enough that Lewis could hear the crump of the detonations over the engine noise. The aircraft shuddered as shrapnel peppered the fuselage. A piece of metal punched through the cockpit canopy 3 inches from Hayes's head, spider-webbing the plexiglass and admitting a screaming stream of freezing air at 18,000 feet. "Maintain course," Lewis ordered, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to jink, to evade, to do anything except fly straight and level into a sky full of exploding steel. But the bomb run required stability. Any deviation would throw off Farabee's calculations and waste their entire mission. More flak erupted around them. The sky had transformed into a killing field, each black burst representing thousands of jagged metal fragments capable of shredding aluminum skin, severing control cables, or killing crew members. In the radio compartment, Sergeant Schumard felt something punch into his station with a metallic clang. A piece of shrapnel the size of a fist had torn through the fuselage and embedded itself in the radio transmitter, reducing the primary communications set to a smoking ruin. He immediately switched to the backup radio, his hands moving with automatic precision even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "Bombardier to pilot, I have the target." Farabee's voice was ice calm. 30 seconds to release. 30 seconds. Lewis gripped the yoke with white-knuckled intensity, willing the aircraft to stay on course. Another flak burst erupted directly ahead, close enough that the concussion rocked the bomber and sent instruments bouncing against their stops. The smell of explosive residue filled the cockpit, acrid, chemical, the scent of violence. 20 seconds. Hayes watched the number 2 engine cylinder head temperature gauge climb into the red zone. They were asking too much of these engines, running them too hard for too long. Something was going to give. The question was whether it would give before or after they dropped their bombs. 15 seconds. A Japanese fighter appeared off the left wing, a Nakajima Ki-84 Frank, one of Japan's newest and most capable interceptors. Karen's tail guns erupted with the hammering roar of twin .50 calibers, tracers arcing across the sky. The fighter broke away, trailing smoke, but two more appeared to take its place. 10 seconds. Doors are open. Sight is calibrated. Target is locked. Lewis could see it now, the industrial complex that was their target, a sprawl of factories and warehouses clustered along a river. Smoke from earlier raids still hung over the city, a gray pall that marked where other bombers had already struck. 5 seconds. Time seemed to slow. Lewis was aware of everything simultaneously. The flak bursting around them, the fighters maneuvering for attack position, Hayes calling out the engine temperatures, Miller watching the gauges with the intensity of a man witnessing his own death, the vibration of the airframe, the howl of wind through the shattered cockpit canopy. Bombs away. The B-29 lurched upward as 6,000 pounds of high explosive dropped from the bomb bay. Lewis felt the release through the controls, the sudden lightness, the increased responsiveness. Farabee had toggled the bombs in a stick, spacing them to saturate the target area. 12 bombs, falling through 18,000 feet, accelerating toward terminal velocity. Bomb bay doors closing. "Get us out of here, Captain." Lewis was already banking left, pushing the nose down into a diving turn that would build airspeed and get them away from the killing zone of concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The bomber responded more eagerly now, thousands of pounds lighter, the three engines no longer laboring quite so desperately. But they weren't clear yet. One of the key 84s had worked around to their 6 o'clock position, coming in fast with guns blazing. Karen's tail guns tracked the fighter, but the Japanese pilot was skilled, jinking and sliding, making himself a difficult target. Tracers from the fighter's 20mm cannons walked up the fuselage toward the tail section. "Taking fire aft," Karen shouted. "He's..." The 20mm rounds found their mark. One punched through the tail gunner's plexiglass bubble. Another severed hydraulic lines running along the fuselage spine. A third, purely by chance, struck the No. 4 engine's oil cooler. Miller saw it immediately. No. 4. Losing oil pressure on No. 4. Lewis's eyes snapped to the gauges. The No. 4 oil pressure needle was plummeting, 60 psi, 40, 20. Without oil pressure, the engine would seize within minutes, the moving parts welding themselves together from friction and heat. "Feather No. 4. Lewis ordered. Hayes's hand moved to the feathering button, but before he could activate it, the decision was made for them. The No. 4 engine, starved of lubrication, locked up solid. The propeller windmilled for 2 more revolutions, then froze. The sudden stoppage sent a violent shudder through the airframe. They were down to 2 engines. The B-29 began to descend immediately. Lewis pushed the throttles on engines 1 and 2 to their stops, past maximum continuous power, past the red line, into the emergency war power setting that would give them full thrust for perhaps 15 minutes before the engines literally tore themselves apart. "Get me a heading to the nearest emergency field," Lewis snapped. "Dutch, we need options right now." Van Kirk's response was immediate. "Iwo Jima. Bearing 150, range 640 miles. It's the only airfield between us and Tinian that can handle a B-29. 640 miles. On 2 engines. With a damaged aircraft and a fuel load that was already marginal. Can we make it?" Hayes asked, though he already knew the answer would be close. Miller was calculating frantically, pencil scratching across his notepad. "Maybe. If we can hold 8,000 feet, if we get favorable winds, if these 2 engines don't quit on us, if we burn every drop of fuel in the tanks. Maybe." Too many ifs. Lewis turned the bomber toward Iwo Jima and descended to 8,000 feet, trading altitude for airspeed, trying to find the sweet spot where the engines could maintain power without burning fuel faster than the aircraft could fly. The mathematics of aerodynamics and thermodynamics had become a matter of life and death. Behind them, Japan receded into the distance. The fighters broke off pursuit at the coastline, unwilling to venture too far over the open ocean. The flak ceased. For the first time in 20 minutes, the sky around them was empty of threats. But the ocean below was vast, and they were falling toward it on two engines that were living on borrowed time. The Pacific stretched beneath them like hammered metal, its surface reflecting the midday sun in a million glittering points of light that made Lewis's eyes ache. 2 hours had passed since they'd turned toward Iwo Jima. 2 hours of watching fuel gauges tick downward, watching engine temperatures hover in the red zone, watching the altimeter slowly, inexorably unwind despite their best efforts. They were at 4,200 feet now. They'd started this leg at 8,000. Miller stood behind the pilots, his notepad covered in calculations that he'd revised a dozen times. Each revision had given them narrower margins, longer odds. His latest figures showed they would run out of fuel approximately 43 miles short of Iwo Jima. 43 miles might as well have been 400. "How's Karen?" Lewis asked, not taking his eyes from the horizon. "Superficial wounds from the plexiglass," Miller reported. "Stiboric patched him up. He's still at his station." Lewis nodded. Professional to the end, even bleeding. That was the caliber of men he was privileged to fly with. The intercom crackled. "Navigator to pilot. I have Iwo Jima on radar. Range 120 miles, bearing dead ahead. 120 miles. 15 minutes at their current ground speed. Except they didn't have 15 minutes of fuel. Miller's latest calculation gave them maybe 10. Lewis made a decision. "Radio, send a distress call. Tell them we're a B-29 with battle damage, 2 engines out, and critically low on fuel. We need emergency landing priority and fire equipment standing by." Schumard was already transmitting before Lewis finished speaking. The backup radio was lower power than the primary system, but at this range it would reach Iwo Jima. The response came back within seconds, the radioman's voice tinny through the speaker. "Roger, Dimples 8-2. You are cleared for emergency landing runway 24. Fire equipment is rolling. Weather is clear, winds light and variable. We have you on radar. Current altitude shows 4,200 feet. Maintain heading and descend at pilot's discretion." "Pilot to crew," Lewis announced. "Prepare for emergency landing. Secure all loose equipment. Bombardier and navigator, get out of the nose and take crash positions. Gunners, out of the turrets. Everyone in the radio compartment, strapped in tight." The crew moved with practiced efficiency, each man knowing exactly what to do. In the nose, Farabee and Van Kirk abandoned their stations and crawled back through the tunnel to the radio compartment where there were proper seats with shoulder harnesses. The gunners left their weapons unmanned and did the same. Within 90 seconds, every crew member except Lewis, Hayes, and Miller was secured in the safest part of the aircraft. Miller stayed on his feet between the pilots, watching the instruments, managing the 2 remaining engines like a conductor managing a dying orchestra. 90 miles. The radar showed Iwo Jima clearly now, that pork-chop-shaped island that had cost 26,000 American casualties to capture just 5 months earlier. The runways that had been built on that blood-soaked volcanic rock were about to save 12 more American lives. If they could reach it. "Fuel state?" Lewis asked, though he could see the gauges himself. Tank 1 showing 180 gallons. Tank 2 showing 145. Miller's voice was flat, emotionless. Both men knew that at their current consumption rate, those numbers represented about 8 minutes of flight time. 8 minutes to cover 90 miles. They needed 11. The engines were running so lean that Lewis could hear the difference in their sound. A harsh, ragged quality that spoke of fuel starvation, of combustion chambers struggling to find enough gasoline to keep the fires burning. 70 miles. Lewis began descending more aggressively, trading what little altitude they had left for airspeed. The bomber accelerated in the dive, the airspeed indicator climbing past 180 knots. He would come in fast, use that speed to stretch their glide if the engines quit, pray that the runway was long enough to stop them before they ran out of real estate. "I can see it," Hayes said suddenly, pointing ahead. There, on the horizon, a dark smudge that might have been a cloud but wasn't. Iwo Jima. Mount Suribachi rising from the island's southern tip, the extinct volcano where Marines had raised the flag in the photograph that had become iconic. 60 miles. Tank 1's fuel gauge touched zero. The number 1 engine coughed, ran rough for 3 seconds, then smoothed out again as it began drawing fuel from the reserve tank. Miller watched the engine instruments with the intensity of a man watching his own heart monitor. "Number 1's on reserve," he reported. "Maybe 3 minutes left." 50 miles. They were at 2,000 feet now, descending through broken clouds. The ocean was close enough that Lewis could see individual waves, could judge the wind direction by the foam patterns on the water's surface. Hayes had the landing checklist out, running through the pre-landing procedures even though they were still 50 miles from the runway. 40 miles. The number 1 engine coughed again. This time it didn't smooth out. The RPM gauge fluctuated wildly. 2,200, 1,800, 2,000, 1,600. The engine was dying, starving, running on fumes. "We're going to lose number 1, Miller said quietly. 30 miles. Lewis could see details on Iwo Jima now. The runway, a long gray strip across the black volcanic sand. The buildings clustered near the airfield. The ocean breaking against the rocky shore. It looked close. It looked impossibly far. Number 1's RPM dropped to 1,000. The engine was finished, nothing left to give. Hayes feathered the propeller without waiting for the order. The number 1 engine fell silent. They were down to 1 engine. One Wright R-3350 Cyclone, running on reserve fuel, keeping a 70,000-pound aircraft, still heavy with remaining fuel in the other tanks and the weight of 12 men, from falling into the Pacific. 20 miles. The B-29 was sinking now, descending at 300 feet per minute despite Lewis's best efforts. At this rate, they would hit the ocean 3 miles short of the runway. Miller, transfer all remaining fuel to Tank 2. Emergency pumps, everything. I want every drop we have feeding number 2. Miller's hands flew across the fuel management panel, opening cross-feed valves, activating boost pumps, coaxing fuel from every tank in the aircraft toward the 1 engine that still ran. 15 miles. The fuel gauges showed the transfer, numbers dropping in tanks 3, 4, and 5, the needle in tank 2 rising marginally. They'd bought perhaps 90 seconds of additional engine time. 10 miles. They were at 800 feet. The runway was clearly visible now, straight ahead. Fire trucks lined the taxiway, red lights flashing. An ambulance. Crews standing by with foam generators in case the bomber came in hot and caught fire. 5 miles. The number 2 engine coughed. The RPM fluctuated. The bomber shuddered. "Come on," Lewis whispered, his hands gentle on the yoke, nursing every foot of altitude from the dying aircraft. "Come on, girl. Just a little farther." 3 miles. They were at 400 feet, below the normal approach path, but they were going to make it. They were going to reach the runway. Lewis could see the threshold markers, the painted numbers on the concrete. 2 miles. The number 2 engine coughed again, ran rough for 5 seconds, and then, miraculously, smoothed out one last time. The fuel pumps had found one final reservoir of gasoline somewhere in the system, enough to keep the engine running for perhaps 30 more seconds. 1 mile. Lewis dropped the landing gear. The hydraulic system, damaged by the fighter's cannon fire, groaned in protest but managed to push the wheels down and locked. 3 green lights on the panel confirmed gear down. The runway threshold passed beneath them. They were over land. Lewis chopped the throttle on number 2, and at that exact moment, the engine died, fuel exhaustion, complete and final. The B-29 was now a glider, all 4 engines silent, coasting on momentum and the last dregs of airspeed. The main wheels touched concrete with a chirp of rubber. Lewis held the nose up, bleeding off speed, then let the nose wheel settle. He stood on the brakes, feeling them bite, feeling the bomber slow. They rolled for 4,000 feet before stopping, silent except for the wind and the tick of cooling metal. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Hayes began to laugh. Not hysteria, but genuine mirth, the laughter of men who had looked death in the face and somehow walked away. "Dimples 8-2 to tower," Lewis finally said into the radio. "We are on the deck. Secure from emergency. Request fuel truck and maintenance crew. And someone bring us some coffee." The maintenance assessment took 3 hours. The number 3 engine had indeed thrown a cylinder, just as Miller suspected. Number 4's oil cooler was completely destroyed. Numbers 1 and 2 had run so hot and so long that they needed complete overhauls. The B-29 wouldn't fly again for a week. But 12 men climbed out of that aircraft under their own power. 12 men who, by every law of physics and probability, should have been at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Captain Robert Lewis stood on the tarmac of Iwo Jima, watching the sun set over the ocean that had nearly claimed them. The island had been purchased with American blood, 26,000 casualties, 7,000 dead. The generals had justified that cost by saying Iwo Jima would serve as an emergency landing field for damaged B-29s returning from Japan. On June 18, 1945, that prediction proved prophetic. Lewis thought about the Marines who had died taking this island. Thought about the men in Washington who had planned the invasion. Thought about the ground crews back on Tinian who had maintained the engines that had, against all odds, kept running just long enough. War was mathematics and logistics, tactics and strategy. But it was also moments like this, 12 men alive because a single engine had run 30 seconds longer than it had any right to, because an island existed in exactly the right place, because a crew had refused to quit even when physics and fuel gauges said they should. Miller walked up beside him, still holding the notepad full of calculations. "We burned 7,340 gallons of fuel on this mission," he said. "We landed with approximately 3 gallons remaining in the system. That's 0.04% of our total capacity." Lewis nodded slowly. 3 gallons. 3 gallons, Miller confirmed. That's what stood between us and the ocean. Roughly 45 seconds of flight time. They stood together in silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and red, listening to the Pacific waves break against the volcanic shore of an island that had already saved so many lives. 3 gallons. Sometimes that's all it took.